been doing a kind of informal, unofficial series on thinking academically about the supernatural, the inexplicable, the paranormal, the strange more broadly. We had Matthew Bowman on earlier this month to talk about 1960s alien abduction in the American counterculture. And to continue this theme and take us a little further back in history, I am delighted to have Professor Carlos Eire with us, author of They Flew. A bit about Carlos. He is the T. Lorison Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale. He specializes in the social, intellectual, religious, and cultural history of late medieval and early modern Europe, and is the author of, among others, War Against the Idols, The Reformation of Worship from Erasmus to Calvin, From Madrid to Purgatory, The Art and Craft of Dying in 16th Century Spain, A Very Brief History of Eternity, many more books, a biography of Saint Teresa of Avila, and finally, this most recent book, They Flew, A History of the Impossible, which we'll be talking today. I have to say, add this from your bio because I have to ask, all of his books are banned in Cuba, where he has been proclaimed an enemy of the state, a distinction he regards as the highest of all honors. I'm adding that to the question stack. Carlos, thank you so much for being here. I am looking forward to get started. The way that we're just going to work, a little bit of housekeeping, is that we're going to have a Q&A for 30, 40 so minutes. During that time, if audience members have questions, feel free to put them in the chat as you think of them. We'll go to them later. But that way we can kind of get through the conversation. I'll know what's on the stack conversationally as well. And then once we're through with those, I'll invite those of you watching to ask questions verbally or still in the chat if you want, and we'll sort of open it up to a broader, more freewheeling discussion. And finally, we'll end with the one thing you're not supposed to do, which is comments rather than questions. And those will be solicited in due time after the questions. So I guess the first question I have for you, Carlos, is a methodological one. You talk about kind of the study of these impossible or seemingly impossible phenomena, levitation in the early modern world being the sort of most prominent among them. How should we think as historians, as academics, about how to approach these accounts of things that appear to, quote unquote, common sense to be completely impossible? And what are some of the methodological challenges in that?
Well, the primary methodological challenge in our day and age is that since the 18th century, increasingly, some phenomena have been declared absolutely impossible. And all testimonies, no matter how convincing they might be in terms of the people involved, the number of people involved, the information conveyed, no matter what, anyone in the past or in the present who testifies they have seen something like this that's impossible is a liar. So therefore, anyone who believes the testimony has to be either a fool or himself a liar, himself or herself. Which is what I had been encountering, not too frequently, but frequently enough since the book came out. See, this, I knew this going into the project, that this was the major obstacle that everyone has faced who is a serious academic, major obstacle that they have faced in taking up these subjects. Because you're risking precisely this kind of rejection offhand. It's not like you think you're going to open people's minds to this. No, you know that you're going to have pushback. You know you're going to have resistance. So accepting testimonies, that's a challenge. But we historians, if we've been trained the right way, we have ways of weighing the significance of testimonies and the probability of testimonies being believable. In the same way, using the same principles that any lawyer or judge might use in a court of law about what kind of testimony has veracity to it and what percentage of veracity one might be able to find in certain testimonies.
So I'm curious then to kind of then take this in the more specific direction, which is the specific testimonies you write about in your book. If you so for those of you who have not read it yet, and I strongly recommend that you do, sort of we're focusing specifically on certain potentially religious, potentially demonic, potentially there's a sort of open question there, but phenomena of levitation and levitation and bilocation seeming to be two places at once as these particular phenomena of interest. For, can you sort of set the stage for us of what is going on in Europe, particularly the Iberian Peninsula during that time? What are some of the tensions that are playing out in these questions of the seemingly miraculous or the supernatural?
Well, there's an unbroken line of reports of testimonies of these phenomena occurring, stretching all the way back millennia, and not just in Europe and not just in the Christian religion. This is a phenomenon, a worldwide, it's a global phenomenon. And global both in terms of time and place. We can go back the earliest recorded history and find accounts of this occurring. So what happens in Europe in the 16th and 17th century, which we can return to this, is actually the peak period for flying people in European history, in Western history. What you have is the whole medieval heritage, Christian heritage, where these physical phenomena that accompany mystical ecstasy are reported. But in 1517, things change, which is when the Protestant Reformation takes off. And all of the major leaders of the Protestant Reformation, of the first generation, second generation, into the third generation, so we're now well into the 17th century, they reject the possibility that God could do any such thing or would do any such thing. And beginning with Martin Luther in Germany, in Saxony, then Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland, in Zurich, and many others, and then second generation John Calvin in Geneva. They stick very, very closely to a theology in which miracles, such as the ones encountered in the Bible, can no longer happen. As a matter of fact, they have a theory, not a theory for them. It's a doctrine. The doctrine is known by the name the cessation of miracles. And the teaching is that the miracles that one reads about in the New Testament performed by Jesus and his 12 apostles. In almost every page, you run into them in the Gospels and in the Acts of the Apostles. These miracles stopped abruptly and permanently around the year 100, which is supposedly when the youngest of the apostles died, and that would be the Apostle John, who, according to legend, lived to be close to 100. So, why? Why this argument? Well, there's a very pragmatic reason for having this argument. There are also theological and philosophical reasons. But pragmatically, in terms of the disagreement that is so intense between the Protestant side and the Catholic side. Catholic side can say to Protestants, look at all the miracles we have. This proves that we are the true church. So, for polemical reasons, pragmatic reasons, the early reformers then argue, no, you don't have miracles. What you have are demonic tricks. All of these things that you claim are divine in origin are really not, they're not real miracles. The devil is fooling people into believing that they happen, or the devil can manipulate nature because he knows the laws of nature so well, and he knows how to make levitation happen or bilocation. So we end up with this very, very odd lack of symmetry in the theology of Protestants and Catholics. Catholics are just going in an unbroken line from the time of Jesus to their present. Nothing has changed. Miracles still happen. God still does these things. On the Protestant side, no. God never does these things. Only the devil does it. So the lack of symmetry that I find so amazing, and it helps to explain a lot why this time period produces so many testimonies of levitating people, to a much lesser extent, bilocating people, is that for Protestants who reject so much of Catholic theology, there is still, for a whole set of reasons, there's a need to accept almost completely, without rejecting much, if anything, of Catholic demonology. So the medieval Catholic demonology, Protestants run with it, right? And this gets us later to the witch persecutions and witchcraft trials, and accusations of flying witches and so on and so forth. So the simple way to put this is that you have, on the Catholic side, you have this claim that, yes, sometimes when human beings get really close to God and they go into mystical ecstasy, weird things happen to their bodies. They float. Sometimes they actually fly. And they can be seen in two places simultaneously. Protestants say, well, yeah, these things do happen, but it's always the devil. Because the Protestants also reject the concept of mystical ecstasy. So
I'm curious then, kind of what does it sounds like there's a sort of Protestant openness to the idea that the quote unquote natural could be suspended, or that the laws of nature can indeed be broken. But the only sort of the moral force breaking them is evil. That this is not necessarily a trick or an illusion in the sense that you talk about a magician doing a trick or an illusion, that they're secretly wires. We're talking about there is still some sense of some capacity to transform reality outside of the known bonds of nature, even in a Protestant account.
yeah. And that's the key word, known laws of nature. Because the medieval Catholic argument, actually stretching back to ancient times, is that when the devil does things like this, it's not really supernatural. He's not upending or breaking the laws of nature. He is just so old, so ancient, and so smart that he's really like a very good scientist. He knows how to make these things happen. And he also, in other instances, knows how to fool people into believing that they're seeing things that are not real. So it's a very odd sort of, it's not even an argument. They do argue about it, but it's a belief system. And it is, for Protestants, a fact. And if you want to say, with a capital F, it's a fact. Yes, these things do happen. They're not impossible. They are possible, and the devil is responsible. And there are also a lot of liars on the Catholic side.
Yeah. So yeah, it's just a twofold. Some of them are fakes, and some of them are
Lies. Right. Yeah.
So I was going to ask you this later in the conversation, but what you've just said about the devil as a scientist makes me want to bring this up sooner, which is the question I have about the relationship between religion, magic, and technology in the early modern era, and the way in which some of these categories do overlap. I'm struck at my own sort of personal research interests right now are on Renaissance and later magic, and ways in which the idea that the discovery of the laws of the universe that might allow one to manipulate nature, that there is a kind of magical strain from the modern view and a scientific strain, but these are not easily collapsible. How should we think about the idea of magic and technology at this time? And is that part of the same story you're telling, or a parallel one?
I was going to say, all of this is on a spectrum. Religion, magic, astrology, alchemy. Almost every court in Europe in this time period will try to get an alchemist and an astrologer, and perhaps even a magician. And they'll also have clergy. And the lines separating these ways of handling reality are very fuzzy. It's not till much later that you have sharp dividing lines between empirical science and the places where empirical science was born, which are alchemy, magic, astrology, and also, mathematics, but the empirical process of experimentation has its roots in these areas that later would be thrown basically into the junk closet as magic, or they would be demonized, right? So there's no fixed date when this happens, but it really takes off. The separation of all these things really takes off most intensely in the 18th century.
So I'm curious then, particularly from the 18th century onwards, the role that, and I sort of know that this is a too big word in a sense, or it's perhaps too generic a term, but roughly speaking, the Enlightenment as a sort of background, and I think we can get into why the Enlightenment might not be the best summation of the time, so to speak. But at the same time, I'm curious about quote unquote modern ideas of quote unquote modern science, and how that sort of figuring of what is and is not possible exists in tandem with these stories of this sense that something is impossible or illegitimate in a way that is not necessarily the first answer demons. The first answer is liars.
Yes. Well, I'm just going to bring up one very pivotal figure, Isaac Newton. Most people don't know this, but he actually wrote more on the laws of prophecy than on the laws of nature. He had a keen and profound interest in discovering the law of prophecy as manifested in the Bible, and trying to do it empirically, the same way that he did with with optics and gravity and all the other and the math. I'm told, I haven't seen it myself, but at Cambridge, where his original publications are all stored together on shelves, the shelf space taken up by his obsession with the law of prophecy is longer than the shelf space for his scientific and mathematical work. So what do you do with that? But it's the Newtonian universe that, I was taught this in high school, and I'm sure it might still be taught in high schools. The clockmaker God idea that, God designed all these wonderful rules, created this universe, which works very much like a clock. He charged it up, so to speak. He turned the key, wound it up, and now it runs by itself, and he doesn't get involved. That's the Newtonian God, but Newton still was very, very much convinced that there was more to the universe than the clock. But
So,
yeah, go ahead.
so I'm curious about a procedural sort of this question, which is, let's say it's sub 1650, 1700, and a report goes around that someone is levitating. How does one get from, let's say, a rumor in a convent to someone being kind of established and acknowledged as a levitating mystic? And what are some of the ways that the process might result in them being held up, perhaps ultimately canonized one day, or the process by which ultimately they're revealed to be a quote unquote fraud or demonically possessed? Like, what are some of the different pathways that
Well, one has to distinguish between the Catholic methods and the Protestant methods. Protestant's methods is, you're either involved in witchcraft, which is always about a pact with the devil. Witchcraft is always demonic. Or you're demonically possessed. Your body is possessed by a demon, or demons, plural. That's the Protestant view. So if somebody is actually seen levitating, or there are reports of somebody levitating, the only assumption to make is the devil is involved. And all of those medieval demonological texts, which are, reviewed in some way, reworked also by Protestant churchmen, they have ways of investigating to see how the devil is involved. On the Catholic side, it's more complicated because you've got both possibilities. It could be God, could be the devil. Well, actually, there are three possibilities. Could be God, could be the devil, or it could be faked. So, beginning in the 16th century, methods for investigating such phenomena are devised, and they're devised most intensely in societies and cultures that are 100% Catholic, and especially Iberia, Spain, Portugal, and Italy. Where in Iberia you have an institution, the Inquisition. And in Italy, you also have inquisitions. You have one in Rome, you have one in Venice, and then there are places to where they extend their powers. But the Inquisition works very much like it is a tribunal. It's not a court of law, it's a tribunal, but it uses the same kind of methodology as a court of law does for discerning what is true. But it also has immense powers. So in the Catholic world, criteria are set up for investigating any such report in any such case. You send inquisitors in, and they probe and they ask questions, they observe, And interestingly enough, the inquisitors don't assume that it's impossible for these things to be happening. Matter of fact, they assume that they might be happening, or they pretty well might be happening, but there also might be fakery. So the fakers, they're the easiest to deal with. Lifestyle, behavior. Anyone, male or female, who likes to call attention to themselves and lacks humility is immediately suspected of faking or of being demonically possessed. And in fact, it's, through question and answer and investigation of the lifestyle that the Catholic Church develops this set of guidelines for sorting out the genuine from the fake and the demonic. And in the 17th century, well, let me back up. In the 16th century, after the Council of Trent, so after 1563, very clear guidelines are established for declaring someone a saint. And those rules are made even clearer and stricter in the 17th century. And the process of strengthening what one author has called the rationalization of miracles. It's a wonderful book by Paolo Parigi, The Rationalization of Miracles, that details how by the 17th century, the Catholic Church is actually getting on the scientific bandwagon. And they want absolute empirical proof that such things happen. These investigations can be very lengthy, very complicated, and the archives in Rome are full of these. They have not, as a matter of fact, we've only basically investigated the tip of the iceberg, or maybe even just the frost on the tip of the iceberg of monks and nuns who are investigated because they are having these miraculous physical phenomena take place during mystical ecstasy, or claims are being made that they have this. So I think it's very, very revealing that the churchman who wrote the book, actually it's several volumes, it takes up about this much shelf space. The book's still used for canonizing saints in the Catholic Church. The man behind it was Cardinal Prospero Lambertini, who went on to become Pope Benedict XIV. And what he emphasized was much more important than miracles to declare someone a saint, was heroic virtue. Mm-hmm. Being a good person and actually prevailing against all odds when faced with difficulties. But he still kept the miracles in play. You still needed provable miracles. So what they went for mostly, and is still the case, are healing miracles. Mm-hmm. But by the 18th century, and this is still true today in the Catholic Church, what the Catholic Church looks for in terms of proving a healing miracle are doctors or scientists who are atheists. They want atheists. They look for atheists who can then investigate scientifically and actually conclude that science as we know it has no way of explaining how this healing took place.
Do we have a sense now of approximately what percentage of proposed cases of levitation were found legitimate or illegitimate category A or B, a sense if this was a sort of 50-50 versus a very rare versus very common thing.
No one has quantified this.
Mhm.
Actually, I'm not boasting here. I'm just pointing to a fact. There was a book that came out in 1928, Levitation, by Olivier Leroy, Leroy, which of course went out of print, but now has been republished, reissued. It's available now on Amazon. Leroy did some quantification, but all he had were the printed texts of the Acta Sanctorum, or the Acts of the Saints. And the word levitation did not exist until the 19th century. So he had to look for all these sorts of other Latin terms to find levitators. But since Leroy's book in 1928, and maybe we can circle back to that, because 19th century spiritualism is the reason for that book's existence. No one has done research on these Inquisition cases of feigned miracles or feigned sanctity. Yeah, there's a well, it's a substantial amount of work that's been done on failed saints who don't make it. But really, as I said before, given how much evidence there is in Rome that no one has looked at, this is just the frost on the tip of the iceberg, what we know about who is declared to be a fake levitator, or who actually falls right between the lines. There are many cases. I ran one case in particular of a nun who claimed to bilocate and also to levitate. And the Inquisition did not pronounce her a fake. But because there were questions about her behavior, her humility, she was basically warehoused in a convent other than her own and slipped into obscurity and was never, ever even put up for canonization. So there's a lot to be found out.
One of the things I found most striking in your book that I sort of would not have expected was just the sheer amount of not just one account, but like documentary evidence, testimonial evidence from, as you say, people who are not we have every reason to think are credible, kind of writing about particular figures. I'm thinking particularly of Teresa and of Joseph of Cupertino, where like we have so many accounts from so many different people that don't appear to kind of have known each other. What should we make of that? What should we make of that much material?
Well, that's where I come in and say, if this were any other kind of testimony that was being given, let's say about, stampedes, weather phenomena, anything, crime, the testimonies given by these people would not be discounted offhand. We have testimonies we can match up. As you said, people who didn't know each other. But then you add the numbers, the sheer numbers of testimonies, and then you have to add who these people were and how the information was being gathered. And I can't think of any other circumstance other than the miraculous, where historians just dismiss the testimony offhand because of the phenomena being described. Can you assume, and also as a historian, and I'm dead serious about this, even though the review of my book that just appeared in the New York Review of Books declares my book totally unserious, I'm dead serious about this. The testimony. Can you assume, can any historian really afford to assume that so many people are lying? Especially if you take into account when the canonization process gets rolling, there's a questionnaire that everybody gets the same questions. Kind of a salon. They ask the same questions of everybody. And one of the series of questions is on what miracles have you witnessed? Many of these people testify, know that if they lie, because this is their belief system, they know if they lie, they will go to hell. Because they're taking part in a very, very sacred process. Can one assume that all of these monks and nuns are lying, even though they know that this is a mortal sin that will land them in hell forever? Or that they can be inventing it?
I mean, that does seem like the account of the there are a lying narrative. Let's say let's the story, the version of the story that might someone who dismisses out of hand the facts that these are facts, or that these are facts that happened, might say, well, this is all, this is all lies, political, dodging all the way down. Perhaps there's some kind of a desire on the part of the Catholics to display something to the Protestants at this particularly politically intense time. At the same time, as you do point out, this is a time where religious intensity and mysticism and religious affiliation, identity, feeling are so important that people are dying for it. And it feels that either way, we have to kind of dramatically reimagine our conception of what the early modern mind must look like, insofar as either a lot of people really, really believed this, and whether or not people were levitating, maybe let's even be open to that. This is significant enough that people would not risk their immortal souls by lying about it, to the extent that it seems to be happening, or that enough people who are kind of in positions of power, authority, ecclesiastical positions don't believe it at all, that it is just this kind of smokescreen for the poor peasants.
Right. And then you get, then as a historian, you have to turn into a conspiracy theorist. Yes, all these people are making this stuff up. When in fact, the testimonies of eyewitnesses, it's not just the number of eyewitnesses, it's also the kinds of eyewitnesses that you have. And these witnesses are people who have, literally left the world, includes nuns and monks, people who have, quote unquote, left the world. And in the case of the nuns, have actually imprisoned themselves for life in their convents. That's how seriously they take all this stuff. Now, is it possible that some of them might be lying? Yeah, of course. Because we find plenty of fakers in these convents too. But eventually, at least the cases that I studied, just a handful, they were able to determine who was faking it and who wasn't. So we have no film of 16th and 17th century people flying. But at the other side of the Protestant Catholic spectrum, there's one case I found that involves demonic levitation, 1693 in Boston. And it comes on the heels of the Salem witch trials. And there's a teenage girl in Boston who is demonically possessed, and Puritan clergy are trying to rid her of this possession. The leading Puritan in the Boston area, Cotton Mather, gets involved. And the description you have of this girl levitating is identical to the description of Saint Teresa levitating. Do I think that these Puritans read about Saint Teresa? No, of course they didn't. They wouldn't have any interest in reading about Saint Teresa. And as a matter of fact, in 1693, they wouldn't have been able to get to those canonization documents where all these testimonies are found. So here's the similarity, and why I think that the similarity in and of itself should make doubters pause about not accepting these testimonies. Saint Teresa begs her nuns, if you see me going up, hold me down. Or if I go up, pull me down. But they're unable to do so. They just can't. Even when several of them are pulling on her, they can't bring her down. Same thing happens with this little teenage girl in Boston. There are several quote unquote burly men in the room who jump on top of her. She's not laying in bed and starts to go up. They jump on top of her, but up she goes to the rafters anyway. And then they try to pull her down and they can't. And Cotton Mather makes these men sign affidavits saying, this happened. I was here. This happened. We all saw it. We all tried to pull her down. We couldn't. There's no way that any of those men or Cotton Mather could know about these descriptions of what happened to Teresa of Avila in 1560 something.
So I think that I find, even as I find myself very compelled, I'm curious what your answer would be to kind of, I feel like the skeptic's next question, or which is, why don't levitations happen anymore? Why don't they happen as much anymore in the era of smartphones, in the era of films? And particularly, I'm aware that there are sort of some 20th century cases. Obviously, the Catholic Church still looks for miracles when canonizing saints. What does a sort of what do, let's say, 20th century miracles, or perhaps even 21st century miracles, such as they exist, how do they help fill in the story a bit? Or do they look different now? Are there credible cases now? And how do people, in your experience, who do think or do hold to the idea that what we saw, what happened to Teresa of Avila was a miracle, what happened to Saint Joseph was a miracle? Why are there no miracles now? Is it just a kind of like post-Enlightenment cessation of miracles, or is there a different theological account to their frequency now?
There's very real quantitative, pragmatic explanation, is that there are no longer as many monks and nuns. And there are fewer possessed people, but that also raises questions. Why is that? Evangelical Protestants and other sorts of Protestants still believe in demonic possession. And there's a huge amount of literature. Just look on Amazon for deliverance literature and you'll find. So that's part of it, is that there are fewer people on the Catholic side who are going into mystical ecstasy, because that normally in the past has happened within a monastic setting, which has everything to do with lifestyle. On the Protestant side, the Enlightenment really killed the devil to a substantial extent in mainline Protestantism. Cotton Mather is an outlier then by 1693, actually. In Protestantism already, he's an outlier believing in the devil and believing in witchcraft. But then by the time that we get for instance, the Enlightenment in France, equivalent here in the United States, the American Revolution, and you've got deists writing the Declaration of Independence, drawing up the Constitution. The devil's no longer around for them. So that's one side of what I would say to a skeptic. The other is that I think that there is a relation between what people think is possible and then what becomes possible. Power of belief is something that's very hard to measure or quantify, but I think that belief plays a role. And the number of people who believe certain things, that's actually ultimately quantifiable. But we do have accounts on the Catholic side of levitators and bilocators up through the 20th century. I personally don't know of any living Catholic levitator or bilocator at present. Although I'm sure in my email I will sometime soon or eventually receive an email from someone so I can put you in touch with this or that. So if I could make just a jump.
Yeah, absolutely.
Email I received from an individual who did remote viewing for the CIA.
Remote, sorry?
Remote viewing. For
Viewing.
those who don't know, this is something that was carried out by the CIA and the KGB in the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. Controlled experiments with psychic powers, where people could be placed in a room and asked to visualize what was, thousands of miles away in the Soviet Union or vice versa. And they would draw or describe what they saw. Talk about Newton's documents are dwarfed by the amount of shell space that's taken up by remote viewing. So I get an email from someone who says, I did remote viewing. It can be learned. Well, you have to have a natural gift for it, but it can be learned. And then he added, because he had just read my book, said, I have bilocated during remote viewing. And I can put you in touch with other people who have bilocated during remote viewing. Federal government was paying for this. Crazy as it sounds.
So I want to come back to sort of to feed this now to move us towards the present day, towards the 19th century spiritualist craze and into our own era of the way in which a kind of faith, a faith in faith, so to speak, a belief in the power of belief, uh, might help us think productively about, I don't like the word paranormal, but inexplicable spiritually tinged phenomena in the present age. And I think the title of this talk or this salon is Making Room for the Weird. And I've written before, and many people have written about, like, we are in a new age of weirdness, so to speak, that internet, particularly in the internet fueled religious landscape, there's more interest in things like occultism, astrology, modern witchcraft, the crystals, energy, what have you, that we've seemed to be actually moving, culturally speaking, towards, at least for younger people, a world that is less less full of people who affiliate religiously, but actually perhaps more open to seemingly inexplicable phenomena.
Yes.
This also seems, in my mind, to go hand in hand with, and I've written about this in my own work, and a kind of rise of a resurgence of interest in new thought and new thought adjacent uh, philosophies, the secret manifesting, the idea that that we can actually change reality through our mental states, through our belief. how do you see our kind of, let's say, the contemporary religious landscape, the way in which many people are interested in, drawn to, open to things that might things that might not fit the Enlightenment vision of reality?
Yeah, well, what I find somewhat amusing is that all of the things that the Enlightenment tried to extinguish came roaring back different times and places. So there's something basically human that cannot be squelched. And it has to do with the realization that the world we inhabit, our own existence, is way too weird. Talk about weird. The weirdest thing is existing, being a human being. That's truly weird. We don't know where we came from. We don't know when we got placed here. We don't know what comes after we die. So we want answers to these questions. And there's a necessity, I think. If you view it just from a purely materialistic perspective, our brains are programmed to want more than what we see and touch. So it keeps springing back. That's a purely materialistic argument. I think if you move over into the area of belief and you consider that all religions are belief systems and they differ in their systems, but they're all about transcendence. They're all about some other dimension existing. And the purpose of human life is to get in touch with that dimension. That's what religion's supposedly about. It's not just about going to one place once a week where you meet nice people. Although that's good too. So it keeps coming back. And I think people now, I've seen these surveys, the Pew poll that I saw. It amazed me because there's a higher number of people now than there ever was who call themselves spiritual rather than religious, right? But I also saw this Pew survey, the number of people who really, still in the United States, this is only the United States, right? Numbers are different in Europe. Number of people in the United States who do believe that there's another dimension. And even there was a very high number of people who actually believe in reincarnation in the United States. And I saw something that didn't make much sense to me because number of people who believe in reincarnation does not match the little tiny number of people who declared themselves to be vegetarians or vegans. So they believe in reincarnation, but they're eating, other souls.
Yeah, I mean, one of my sort of favorite reincarnation data statistics is about, I want to say it's about 19, it's between 19 and 30%. It's some really
Yeah.
high number of self-professed Christians say they believe in reincarnation.
Yes.
Which I think is I think it was 2018 Pew, which is one of my most one of those statistics I always trot out to talk about just how weird or how limited our categories for talking about faith and belief really are. That you put it on a form one way and you say you believe this, and you put it on a form another way, and actually you're affirming something that's completely or completely seemingly incompatible.
Right.
Um, which again, it seems to point to this fact that or this truth that your book also raises, which is when it comes to what people, quote unquote, of faith, quote unquote, believed, and whether they were, quote unquote, lying or not, is something that I mean, if it's hard enough to access it now when we're talking about using contemporary polling data to talk about religious belief and observance in 2024 in America, how much harder is it to recover a sense of what people believed or saw or thought when we don't have access to those kind of tools?
We don't. And, spiritualism surprised everybody in the 19th century.
How so?
The Enlightenment was supposed to have done away with all this stuff. And now all of a sudden, people are trying to communicate with the dead. They're levitating, bilocating, and someone as rational as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle ends up, becoming a spiritualist. Not only that, but a great promoter of spiritualism. And I was very amused to find out that we have this large auditorium here at Yale, Woolsey Hall.
Yes.
And Conan Doyle came to New Haven during his American tour and gave a lecture that filled Woolsey Hall. It's large, filled Woolsey Hall. He was coming to talk about spirit photographs. Something that has now been completely debunked, of course, but Conan Doyle was just convinced, that. But he did more than talk about spirit photographs. He also talked about, contacting the spirit world and so on. And New Haven back then was a very industrial town. I can't imagine. I think maybe most of the people who showed up might have been Yale students.
That's fascinating to think about. Certainly.
100 years ago, 1920s.
I'm the 19th century occultism is another particular interest of mine. But before, and we could go down that route, and I want to go down that route. But before I do, we are at the 1 hour mark, which means I do want to make sure we open up to questions. So I know we're a small-ish group. So Dana, Paul, if either of you just want to jump on in, ask your own questions, please feel free. Otherwise, we're going to talk about 19th century occultism.
Well, first of all, this has been really fascinating, and I just want to say thanks for sharing all this. And I will say that my interest, and maybe probably most people, skews a little more contemporary. And given what I've done professionally, which is talk to a lot of remote viewers. Actually, I've worked directly with David Morehouse. Professor Eire, I don't know if it's a name that's familiar to you. He was involved with the original Project Stargate program.
Yeah,
I've talked to.
Just learned of his existence. Yeah.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy, and certainly remote viewing is something that a lot of people take very seriously. I mean, there's the funding was pulled for that program a long time ago, but there are a lot of folks who still who booster it as enthusiastically as one could imagine. I guess one of the things I'm very curious about, and I think Tara, you alluded to this a bit, is where does this sort of all hook into what I'm seeing, and this is really again from a more pop culture perspective with I think the surge, maybe fairly more recently but going back even to the 70s, and maybe in the 70s in particular, was a bounce, and then it tailed off a bit until more recently, but a real desire for evidence of the existence of non-human intelligence, of contact with interdimensional beings, with the longing that I see in so many of the people that I've encountered in my work for some kind of verification that these things are quote unquote real. And my takeaway on some level is that this is just a very sort of primal longing for wonder, something that is going to break us out of the everyday. I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if Bigfoot were real? Wouldn't it be wonderful if there were something that would separate us from the everyday? And I wonder how that ties back to these testimonies from what is the through line here from these things that seem so almost inaccessible to us, 400, 500 years ago, to things that are happening all around us now, or at least the claims of things that are happening all around us now.
Yeah. Well, there's the continuity of the phenomena, for one thing. But as you say, there's also the continuity of this seemingly irrepressible human desire to encounter more. Or let me put it differently, the seemingly irrepressible human need for wonder, as you put it. That it's not just Bigfoot or non-human intelligences, but also some dimension where our own existence can continue after death. And that's what religions are mostly about. How to handle this big problem. You didn't exist, suddenly you're here, and then at some point you're going to be gone again. So is there some other dimension? And I think that there is a very natural explanation. Scientists know which areas of the brain religious experience takes place. I've read some of the literature on these experiments where they located, and I remember there was a cover, I think it was Newsweek magazine. This is your brain, an image. This is your brain on God, and it showed the brain lighting up in certain areas. But I have found out since my book was published how connected this subject is. 16th, 17th century, how connected it remains to this spectrum of phenomena that includes encounters with alien intelligence. I've only begun to encounter a handful of scientists who are taking all of this very seriously in a scientific way. Modern, Enlightenment scientific, empirical science kind of way. But I know that there are more than I have encountered.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, I had an email from a scientist in the UK. He happened to be in Wales. But he was very excited about one fact he saw in my book, and he took it as a fact, that when Joseph of Cupertino levitated, he was always in a cataleptic state, medical term, cataleptic seizure.
Mm-hmm.
Your body stiffens up. And in Joseph's case, his body not only stiffened up and remained in whatever position he was in when he entered his ecstatic state, but his clothes also did the same. And as he levitated, the folds in his habit remained stiff. And it didn't matter how much he moved or how close he came to burning flames. It wouldn't catch on fire. So he was very excited. He said, oh, this really convinces me I've been right all along, that these mystical ecstasies are outside of time-space. And it wasn't just the fact that the folds in his clothing remained stiff, but also the fact that whatever it was that he was doing when he went into his mystical state, he came back and picked up exactly where he had left off, especially when he was saying Mass. Whatever the next word was going to be, that's what he said. So he said, yeah, he was outside of time space. I said, well, no. Then he explained a little further, but he lost me.
Sort of an interdimensional portal sort
That's
of
right.
idea there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I do.
I mean, go ahead.
Sorry,
Sorry.
I want to give Dana a chance to ask one, if Dana, if you would like, although there's no obligation. But otherwise,
I'm okay. I'm just listening. This is very
Okay.
interesting.
Oh, thanks for coming. No worries, no obligation. Just wanted to
Oh,
make sure
thank
before
you.
we went back to more conversation that everyone who wanted to can.
Yeah.
I'm muting myself now. So a question that I have, Carlos, is does in the past 100 years, maybe even the past couple of decades, so sort of as we're getting closer and closer to the internet age and into the internet age, are there other phenomena that take on the role that, let's say, levitation did in 16th, 17th century Iberia? Sort of inexplicable phenomena that become the site of cultural interest, that there's lots of kind of anecdotal cases. Is there a contemporary equivalent?
Well, I think not the only one, but a very prominent contemporary equivalent is alien abductions. It's on the same spectrum. And, you know, the believability of people's accounts then brings us back to that I think is a kind of a tortured question. Are these people lying? They must be lying. They have to be lying. This can't be. But I'm not saying that, you know, I believe 100% of these alien abduction accounts, but I'm, as a historian, looking at contemporary events, I'm puzzled by the high number, the frequency, and also the agreement that people have about this. But another phenomenon that I think is also on the spectrum and is more scientific, and I find fascinating, is near-death experiences. And especially in near-death experience, the ability that these people who have been declared clinically dead, the ability they have to describe things that were going on in their immediate environment when they're brought back to life. And the fact that this is something that only began to happen, these accounts only began to surface when cardiopulmonary resuscitation was put into place as a regular way of getting people whose hearts had stopped to come back to life. So it's only since about 1967 or so. And there's an area where a lot of research has been done. There's even a scientific medical journal, the Journal of Near-Death Experiences, which, unbeknownst to me, I taught at the University of Virginia for 15 years. And that's where much of this research was being carried out. So, yeah, I think there are these two things. We don't have that many levitators or bilocators, but we do have these other things happening. And in the Catholic Church, you still have lots of people who see things, visions, apparitions, and so on. And I was shocked after I had finished doing the research on my book. I found out about something that happened in the 1970s that I never heard of. And I was alive in the 1970s. I was in graduate school. But there was an apparition of the Virgin Mary in Cairo, Egypt, of all places, in a suburb of Cairo. And that it was seen that over 1 million people reported seeing this. Over 1 million people, because it went on for more than 1 year, every day. And most of those million people were Muslims. And it was the Virgin Mary, visible, glowing on top, on the roof of a Coptic Christian church. And I never heard anything about it in the 1970s. Why? Because it was impossible. No self-respecting journalist, I think, in the United States was going to take up this story. It's just too weird. Wait, I lost the audio.
Oh, was there no attempt to debunk it?
Oh, I'm sure there have been. I just kind of, grazed on this information. It came at me, actually, it came at me from an unexpected source, and I just didn't have the time to deal with a deep dive into this.
I'd never heard it before, but here's
It's-
just the very cursory information for everyone to go down their own rabbit holes.
Yeah, I think the name of the suburb is Zaytun.
Zaytun, yep. Our Lady of Zaytun,
Yeah.
starting in 1968. Fascinating, April
I should
6th.
have heard about it, but
So, Paul, let's. Do you have any further questions? I know it sounds like you have come in with sort of quite a few. So, I'd love for you to be able to ask everything you want to ask.
No, this has just been such an interesting perspective on all this, and sort of for me trying to connect some of this across greater spans of time and make sense of where we are culturally now with these. I mean, I think you both have mentioned the Pew surveys about people unaffiliated and the decline of sort of organized religion, but there is, again, I think of this, whether it's a longing for wonder or some kind of, are we searching for saviors? I mean, in every story of aliens, they're either here to save us or they're here to destroy us. It's one way or the other. And I think that is something that holds true with a lot of what I am experienced talking to people really all over the world. They're looking for something that is outside of our experience, and they attach a lot of their sort of more grounded daily anxieties to this notion that these things will lift us up somehow. So I find, literally lift us up. They fly. I find it all.
yeah, no pun intended.
Yeah, I find it all
The
really
funny thing
interesting.
is, when I started talking about levitation some years ago, I immediately discovered the subject caused punning, constant punning. Oh, that's a light subject. Oh, that subject must be hard to get off the ground, so on and so forth.
I'll cut you off with a final question before we can get to more puns. So my final question for you, Carlos, is what ought the role of the academy or the role of historian in the academy be in investigating these questions? Is the potential for their veracity something that should be kind of part of the academic conversation? Do we have to have a different avenue, a different outlet for that? How do you think about it as an academic yourself?
Well, I think that the study of religion, I can understand, the creation of social scientific research on religion and the whole functionalist approach, which is that, you put brackets around the question of what is happening here, but you study the function served by certain beliefs or rituals or symbols. The functionalism serves very, very useful purposes. But I think it kills the study of religion if that's all you do. I mean, it's if religion is about another dimension, why not take that other dimension seriously? And one of the friends I made working on this book was Professor Jeffrey Kripal at Rice University, where, by the way, his archives of the impossible have just acquired all those remote viewing documents. So Jeff has written a book, The Superhumanities, in which he made a clarion call to academics to take the phenomena seriously and stop killing the humanities by draining it of interest on these questions of what is happening and what is really happening. All I'm saying in my book uh, is also what I would say now, which is, you want to be skeptical? Fine. Go back to David Hume and be skeptical. Be very skeptical of everything, including being skeptical of the intersection of dimensions in some way that makes some things that in our dimension, the laws of our dimension, as we understand them now, tell us that they're impossible. Well, maybe they're not impossible. Just be open. Be open also to the idea that things could have happened in the past that no longer happen, or happen with much less frequency. That's all I'm saying. I say I can't prove to you that these people hovered or flew. All I'm saying is remain open, because I have had a few experiences with anthropologists who have confessed behind closed doors that they have witnessed things they could not explain. And it worried them because, you know, they were quote unquote going native when these weird, truly weird things happen. And then another anthropologist told me, yeah, this happens all the time. We talk to each other about these moments behind closed doors, but not out in the open. So I have to say, be skeptical about the impossibility of things.